All right, everybody, let's get started. Have a seat. Okay, so the test marks for the multiple choice are up if you didn't see the announcement, and pretty well. Last time there was a dip in test 3 because there was more content, but it actually went up a little bit. So the average was 50 out of 60 for the multiple choice, so nicely done. And we are now really in the home stretch. We have 2 chapters left, and after that there will be a cumulative final. A reminder that the cumulative final will mostly be about the last 2 chapters. 40 out of the 70 questions will come from chapters 16 and 17, and then 30 questions will be from the prior chapters. The reason for that is, for the prior chapters, you're getting tested on them twice. So if you do the math, it works out to about 7 or 8% of your final grade for each chapter in the multiple choice. And the final will have no written. It's all multiple choice. So the last 2 chapters really go hand in hand. Chapter 16 is on psychological disorders, so different ways that your psychology can go wrong. And then chapter 17 is about different types of therapy, so different ways of helping people who have various psychological disorders. As is always the case, I practice these lectures ahead of time and sometimes add some key terms. So I am now done for the entire book. So I added some terms to 16 and 17, but that is the last time I will do it for any chapter. So heads up about that. I also want to start with a comment on what not to do with this chapter. Being a young adult is a difficult time in life, and it can be very tempting to pry through the book and trying to self-diagnose yourself. I would strongly encourage you to not do it. If you look hard enough, you can probably find something. A little bit of confirmation bias or whatever, but that is not the purpose of these diagnoses. And I think that, in fact, doing that assumes that they're sort of more valid than they are. As we're going to see, many of these disorders, the line between having one and not having one is kind of arbitrary, right? So for example, one thing I'll just say right now is, for example, for depression, there's different cutoffs, but one cutoff has to do with time. How long do you have the symptoms? And it's 2 weeks, which I think is a bit short, actually. And you can search through the literature trying to find a good reason, and it's kind of a matter of convention. It's a matter of judgment. There's not like a clear, bright line in nature that on the 15th day you have 5 or more symptoms from the list of 8. All of a sudden you glow, and now you have this magic condition called depression. That's not the way it works. So I would strongly discourage searching through trying to self-diagnose. And this actually relates to the first issue that we're going to talk about, which is defining psychological disorder. This is a very difficult thing to do. Right? Where do we set the lines? And here's a way of framing the issue. Most, maybe all, but certainly most, psychological disorders are continuous with ordinary experience. So let's say we have here like a range of how sad you can be. So let's say like on this end, you are bedridden like all day, you're constantly crying, you are unable to get out of bed, you're constantly thinking about killing yourself, and are unable to do essentially anything else. Okay, clearly that person needs help. Right? If anything counts as a psychological disorder, that's going to count. And then over here, let's say you're a little peckish, a little hungry. You go into the kitchen to find cookies. You open the cookie jar, and there are no cookies. And you're sad for like 5 minutes. Okay, we're not going to give you antidepressants, right? That's not a serious condition. But then we have everything in the middle. And the question is, where do we draw the line and say, okay, now you have a psychological disorder? And as I was kind of saying earlier, we draw it somewhere. Right? For practical reasons, we have to draw a line somewhere, but that line is by its nature going to be somewhat arbitrary. There are three variables that we use in making our decision for where to draw that line that the book talks about. The first one is, it should be distressing to the person or to the people around them. In other words, someone has to be hurt, psychologically or physically, by the disorder. If no one's harmed or no one's upset, we're not going to call it a mental disorder. So typically it's going to be distressing to self, and the DSM, which we'll talk about later, the standard book for defining mental disorders, will sometimes define the distress as being clinically significant, which kind of leaves it up to the judgment of the clinician, right? But it should be what the DSM calls clinically significant distress to the person. Although for some disorders, distress for the person suffering from the condition is not required. So one classic example is antisocial personality disorder, also known as psychopathy, right? Being a psychopath. They might be perfectly fine, but if they have this nasty habit of murdering people and things like that, they might be causing problems for others. It could still be classified as a disorder. Number two, it should be dysfunctional in some way. Now, some people in the kind of evolutionary psychology research tradition may want to define this as being counter to its function, like functioning in a way that it's not designed to do, but that's not what it means. What it means in the DSM-5 is it interferes with your ability to function normally. So the DSM-5 will often have something like, it should interfere with your ability to work, to get along with your friends, to do the normal things that you do, right? So in other words, if you have a set of symptoms, but you're able to go about your life successfully, for some disorders that will disqualify you from having it. Right, we saw an example kind of like that back in the intelligence chapter. To be diagnosed as having an intellectual disability, you have to have both an IQ of below 70 and be unable to live independently and things like that. The last criterion is it should be deviant. And by deviant, the book essentially means rare. It should be unusual. We could define psychological disorders to be so broad that they would include almost everyone. And hey, the Buddha said life is suffering. Maybe we all do have psychological disorders, but if we define it in that way, it's not particularly useful, right? If you define it so broadly that every single person has it, it's not going to be useful for making decisions like who gets medication or who doesn't. So you should define it in such a way that it's narrow, that it's only a subset of people who have it. So the 3 Ds should be distressing to self or others. It should be dysfunctional, meaning it interferes with your ability to function normally, and it should be deviant, meaning it's rare or it's goes against kind of the normal way of being in the world. Any questions about those 3? Okay, the book then has a discussion of the history of approaches to psychological disorders, and the history presented relies on a common way of presenting the history of ideas. You'll see this in other textbooks that go over the history of different fields of study. And what I'm gonna draw out the major steps on the board. This is a good model to know. It's a good kind of way of modeling the history of human thought. It is an oversimplification. Some historians would be critical of this overly simplistic way of framing it, but it is helpful for kind of organizing how the history of ideas unfolded. The standard way of presenting the history of ideas is the The first important stage is the ancient Greeks, to some extent the ancient Romans. So as I'm sure many of you know, the ancient Greeks came up with what we now think of as science, philosophy, democracy, and various other ideas. Whereas prior to that, there was widespread ignorance about, the way the world worked, what an atom was, or whether the world was flat or round. Some people think that Columbus and people around that time thought the world was flat and he figured it out, but no, the ancient Greeks figured out that the world was round. That's how long ago we knew. So that's where science and philosophy and things like that were born. And this period also included a humanizing influence on the way we treated people who were mentally ill or mentally disordered. Prior to the ancient Greeks, people who had abnormal behavior were treated pretty badly. There's examples in the book. There's a pretty disturbing picture of a skull with a hole through it. It seems to be the case that people with abnormal behavior, they assumed it was evil spirits, so they would drill holes in people's heads to let the evil spirits out. Turns out to not be very effective, but the ancient Greeks were the first, or at least among the first, to say, no, these disorders are not due to evil spirits. They are due to abnormal biology. Something's wrong in their body or brain. Now, the details of their theories of what causes disorders were completely crazy. It had to do with levels of bile and blood and these other goofy things. But it was, as I say, a humanizing influence because they said, we shouldn't be mistreating these people, we should be giving them help. They're just like someone who's physically sick. We should be trying to treat them, not drilling holes in their heads. And again, this is a bit of an oversimplification, but during the Middle Ages, sometimes called the Dark Ages, there were in some ways a return to mistreatment of people who were perceived to be mentally ill. Often, again, it was chalked up to evil spirits and things like that. And there was a decrease in interest in the works of the ancient Greeks. This is when people in Europe were burning libraries and people. During this time, it was actually the Islamic world that preserved the works of people like Aristotle, and where they were doing the more innovative work in math and science. These were then rediscovered by Europe in the 14th century, and to some extent a little before. Aquinas used Aristotle to some degree. And then there was the Renaissance, which was a renewal of interest in the works of the ancient Greeks, people like Aristotle. And I won't test you on the details of this. This is just to kind of orient you as far as the history of how people with disorders were treated. Now I'm running out of room in this direction, but this then led to the scientific revolution, an emphasis on using observation and experiment to test ideas, not just relying on tradition and authority. And slightly after that was the Enlightenment, which was about an emphasis on reason. And both of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment kind of go hand in hand. They both have to do with not taking authority on faith, not just trusting whatever the authorities say, but testing ideas through reason and evidence. And getting back to the idea of psychological disorders, the Enlightenment also, like the ancient Greek period, had a humanizing influence on how people with mental disorders were treated. This is when there was a move towards being more humane. So again, don't worry about the details, but that's one way to kind of frame the history. One model that today unifies the different approaches to psychological disorders is the vulnerability stress model, sometimes called the diathesis stress model. But vulnerability is easy to remember, that's what the book calls it. So the idea here is to get a psychological disorder, you need two things. You need vulnerability, so some kind of pre-existing risk of developing a disorder. Now, in textbooks I've seen, sometimes vulnerability is defined as exclusively a genetic vulnerability. This book defines it more broadly, so we'll go with the book. But it's any pre-existing vulnerability. So the most obvious is genetic. We will see that virtually all of the psychological disorders that you can get have a genetic component. Some are more heritable than others, so schizophrenia and bipolar are extremely heritable. Others, like depression and anxiety, have a genetic component. You can inherit a risk for developing it. But as I say, the book defines it more broadly. It would include early childhood experience or early conditioning. You may have learned a certain way of interacting with the world, a certain way of responding through conditioning or early childhood experience. Those are also going to count as pre-existing vulnerabilities. And then the stress part, or stressor part, is some kind of negative experience that causes or triggers the disorder. Disorders are typically preceded by some kind of event, some kind of traumatic or negative stress or event. One simple way of thinking about this, so again, think of the genetic vulnerability. Take schizophrenia. So we're going to be spending some time talking about schizophrenia, probably on Thursday. And by the way, I'll say it right up front, schizophrenia does not mean split personality. That's a different disorder. I don't know how that myth started, but people sometimes think that's what schizophrenia means. Schizophrenia is a split from reality. So it involves like hearing voices, believing things that are crazy and not true, disorganized speech, and various other types of irrationality, and again, splitting away from the real world. And in the general population, schizophrenia is about 1%. About 1% of the population has schizophrenia, more or less cross-culturally, as it turns out. But if your identical twin has schizophrenia, your chances shoot up to 50%. So pretty substantial genetic contribution, but still only 50%. So it can't be completely genetic or completely a matter of vulnerability. There must be something in the environment that triggers it in one of the twins, but not in the other. Okay, any questions about anything I've said so far? Okay. As always, when we're dealing with defining things in psychology, our two main criteria for a good definition are reliability and validity. These mean something slightly different in this context. So these are about, so it's up to us how we define these disorders. As my professor once said, the definitions for psychological disorders did not come down to us on stone tablets from God. We had to kind of make them up, and there are better and worse ways of defining them. Reliability means that the definition, when used by clinicians, you get similar results for the same people. So basically, inter-rater reliability, back from the intelligence chapter. So the definition that I list in the DSM should be clear enough that if two different clinicians use it on someone, they should agree on whether they have the disorder or not. The higher the level of agreement, the more reliable a diagnostic definition is. Validity is about whether the definition captures essential features of the disorder. So there are, groups of people in the world who have a lot of symptoms in common. So there are lots of people out there who, about 1% of the population, who have a roughly common set of symptoms. They hear voices, they believe wild things, their speech is disorganized, etc. So we call that schizophrenia. And we try to make a definition of it. And the definition should capture the kinds of symptoms that those people tend to have. If you're missing key symptoms that they often have, then that would mean the definition is less valid. And as I said earlier, the main handbook for diagnosing mental disorders is the DSM. There's also the ICD, but the DSM is by far the most, especially in North America, the most commonly used, and it's currently in its 5th edition, so the DSM-5. DSM stands for Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's a big fat book. It's got a list of all the different psychological disorders that you can have and what the criteria are for each of them. And this is the best we have, but it is a highly fallible document. Yes?
Can you say what DSM stands for?
Yeah, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. But it is a highly fallible document. There's a great quote from Immanuel Kant. From the crooked timber of man, or we would say of humans today, like from the crooked timber of man, no straight thing was ever made. In other words, everything humans make is imperfect. As one example, the first edition of the DSM came out in the 1950s, and homosexuality was listed as a mental illness. This was changed in the DSM-2, which came out in the mid-70s. I know this because I actually had and the book mentions it too, but I had a professor who was an elderly gentleman, and he was practicing towards the end of the DSM, the first edition. So he was treating someone who had the mental illness of homosexuality. And the DSM-2 came out, the guy came in for his weekly therapy or whatever, and my professor said, "Hey, I've got good news. You're cured." I said, "What do you mean?" He's like, "I still like men." He's like, "Nope, it's not a disorder anymore. Good to go." That was the last session. So, as I say, it is a fallible document. One example from the DSM-5, I once did a research project on criticisms that had been made of the DSM-5. One change that they made was they got rid of something called the bereavement exclusion. So in prior editions, if you had all the symptoms of depression, but your spouse had just died, you were not diagnosed as having a mental disorder. Because remember that the time cutoff is 2 weeks. If you have a certain set of symptoms for longer, actually here, I'll show you what it looks like. I have the picture of the DSM-5 here. This will give you a sense of what's usually on it. Again, I strongly discourage using it for self-diagnosis, but so these are the criteria for major depression in the DSM-5. So there's 8 possible symptoms, and you have to have at least 5 for most days, most of the time, for at least 2 weeks. And one of those 5 has to be the first 2. So, low mood most of the day, nearly every day, or diminished interest or pleasure in most of your activities nearly every day. And then, 5 total, some of the other ones that are listed. And those for at least 2 weeks. In the DSM-4, if you had those symptoms, but your spouse just died, that was considered normal. But now, with the DSM-5, if you have these symptoms after your spouse dies, you have a mental illness. Which, I don't know, if anything, isn't it if you don't have these, you have a mental illness? I'm more inclined to think that. So there's So it's an ongoing matter of debate, things like that, but that's one example of the kind of thing that psychologists argue about. Another change that the DSM-5 made that I'm much more sympathetic to is a move towards a more dimensional approach. So all of the prior editions of the DSM, and the DSM-5 is still mostly this, but the other editions were exclusively categorical, meaning you either have the disorder or you don't. Right? You set like a bright line and say, past this point, you have OCD or you have depression or whatever the disorder is. The DSM-5 tried to move to some degree towards a dimensional approach, where they're conceptualized not as categories, but as being on a range. You can have more or less of these traits and be somewhere on that range. So one place where they moved partly in this direction is personality disorders. The personality disorders, which we'll talk about either on Thursday or maybe Tuesday, if we run out of time, are, a lot of them are highly overlapping. For example, narcissism and psychopathy are highly overlapping. So the DSM-5 included these dimensions. So the dimensions are here, so like negative emotionality, introversion, all these other things. And each personality disorder can be defined as whether you are high or low in those various dimensions. So here, psychopathy is defined as being high on disinhibition, so you kind of do whatever comes into your head. And antagonism, which is about being a little evil, right? Kind of callous to the suffering of others, willingness to use violence and manipulation to get what you want. So psychopathy is defined as being high on those. Borderline is defined as being high on a number of them. And so the DSM-5 is still primarily categorical. Hopefully the DSM-6 moves more in that direction. Personally, I think it makes more sense to conceptualize them that way. Because the categorical approach treats mental disorders more like cancer, where you either have it or you don't. But for many disorders, that seems kind of strange. Like think of the depression example, right? Depression is clearly a dimensional thing. It's on a continuum with ordinary experience. And there's a great risk in categorizing someone as having a mental disorder. All of a sudden their behavior is easy to interpret as further evidence that they are crazy or what have you. A note about the key terms, I mentioned that I changed some things. In the list for chapter 17, I had David Rosenhan's, or it might just be Rosenhan's study, but whatever the Rosenhan thing is, I've now moved it to the chapter 16 bit. So David Rosenhan did this study where he and his graduate students, his colleagues, checked themselves into a psychiatric hospital. And they reported that they were hearing voices. That's it. They reported one symptom, that they're hearing voices. And they wanted to see how they'd be treated and how their behavior would be interpreted. And what happened was, pretty much everything they did could be interpreted as further evidence of them being crazy, and they were kept in, on average, 19 days. And they were all given the diagnosis schizophrenia, which is like wrong. You can't do that on the basis of one symptom, but that's what they did. And when they were released, they were said to have schizophrenia in remission. So that's really not good. This was done back in the early 70s. So things have improved significantly since then, in part because David Rosenhan published these results, and the psychiatric hospitals kind of looked bad, so they made efforts to improve things. Rosenhan actually told the hospitals that they had checked into what happened, and he said, just so you know, I'm going to send more fake patients to the hospitals. Try to be on the lookout for them. In fact, he didn't, but how long they kept, people went down significantly afterwards because they were being more careful. So, to say a bit more about that study, I have a video of David Rosenhan himself describing the study. Okay, so that's all I have to say about the David Rosenhan study. Next, we have to talk about two terms that you may hear sometimes, but the book rightly points out these are not psychological or medical terms, they are legal terms. One is competent versus incompetent. And sane versus insane. These, as I say, are not psychological terms, these are legal terms. You won't find them in the DSM-5. Competency has to do with whether you are fit to stand trial. It's about your mental state at the time of trial, not at the time you committed the crime or allegedly committed the crime. So if you have no idea what's going on, if you don't really understand the situation, you will be deemed incompetent to stand trial, and this is not a get-out-of-jail-free card. You'll then just be held in an institution until you are ready to stand trial. So it's not something I would recommend faking if you're ever in trouble with the law. One of my guilty pleasures is watching this show called Court Cam. Do any of you watch Court Cam? So it has like scenes of everything you can imagine going wrong in court. My favorite is when people threaten the judge. It's like, how could you think this is going to help your situation? One example is, I don't know what happened to this person, but this person would certainly be a very good candidate for being not competent to stand trial. So she did have a piece of paper there. I don't know if she's faking being crazy. If she is, it's not a good strategy because she'll be held until she's deemed competent, but she was not, in fact, the Crown Prince's wife. Great plot twist. But yeah, someone who genuinely believed that they were the wife of the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia is constantly calling for his intervention, probably not in a position to understand the court proceedings. So that's competency. Sanity is about your mental state at the time you committed the crime. And having a mental disorder alone is not sufficient for being deemed insane, or as we say now, not guilty by reason of mental disorder. The mental disorder you have at the time has to be such that you don't understand what you're doing or that it's wrong. So, for example, being a psychopath would not be a defense. You can't be like, hey, I just really like murdering people, I have no empathy, I have a disorder. You do have a disorder, you will still be found guilty. That will not be a defense. One common disorder that's used in this is schizophrenia. While schizophrenics generally are more likely to be the victims of crime than perpetrators, certain kinds of delusions can lead you to violence. One famous example happened here in Canada. Someone was on a Greyhound bus. How many of you know this story? It's pretty famous, yeah. And he believed that a passenger on the bus was a demon, and that it was God's will that the demon be killed. And so he charged this guy, cut his head off, and did other unspeakable things. And this person didn't hate this guy. He just thought he was in this alternate world where this guy was a demon and had various hallucinations and delusions to go along with it. He was found not guilty by reason of mental disorder, and so then you're still put away, but you're not put in a prison to be punished. You're put in an institution to be cured or to be treated. This is a controversial topic, of course. I'll show a video from the news, because this person was gradually released after it was determined that he was no longer a risk. So we'll watch a video that discusses issues related to that. So there's an example of how these issues connect up with public policy. He was eventually allowed to live in a group home, which is where, as far as I know, he still is now. As the person at the end said, these decisions usually are made in a very risk-averse way, but it still produces controversy, as you can see. Okay, any questions about these two terms? Okay, so now we will start going through the various categories of mental disorders. And for each of them, you will see two different sorts of numbers. I'm just going to explain what each of them are. Those two types of numbers are incidence and prevalence. Both of these refer to the number of cases within a given period of time. And you can say within a year, you can say within people's lifetimes, within 10 years, whatever. Incidence is the number of new cases in a given period. So let's say it's a year. So how many people develop, whatever, OCD within a given year. Prevalence is how many people have the disorder within a given year. So in other words, it's including people who already had it before and continue to have it. So the first umbrella category of mental disorders is anxiety disorders. In terms of prevalence, these have the highest numbers. They are more common than any other umbrella category of disorders. And like depression, these are often continuous with ordinary experience. Anxiety is an adaptive reaction that we have. The world is a dangerous place. The world in which we evolved was an especially dangerous place. And as I said several chapters ago, things can go much more badly than they can go well, right? So from the gene's eye view, from an evolutionary point of view, the worst thing that can happen is you die without leaving any descendants. And that can happen very easily, right? You get eaten by a lion, you're out of the evolutionary contest for good. Whereas the best thing that can happen is, you pass your genes on and your descendants live long enough to pass on their genes as well. So, doing the sorts of things that lead to having kids or having the kids or raising the kids, those are often sources of reward in people's lives. But when you have that kid, it's only provisionally good. It's good for now. That kid could get hit by a bus, as I say, or other things could happen, and then that's the end of the goodness. So things from the gene's eye view are only ever provisionally good. They are never permanently good. Whereas things can be permanently bad because we are so vulnerable. And our nervous systems are designed to be in touch with that reality. There are certain things that we can become anxious about, and for good reason. In Paul Bloom's intro psych lectures, he notes that people with anxiety that's too low, you don't see them in psychiatric hospitals. They go to prison or the morgue, right? If you have no anxiety about anything, bad things happen. But of course, you can go too far the other way, and that's when you get different sorts of psychological disorders. One type of anxiety disorders is phobias of various kinds, different phobic disorders. So, common one is arachnophobia, which the book doesn't mention, right? Fear of spiders. There's agoraphobia, which the book does mention. Agoraphobia is fear of leaving your house and being in public spaces. There is social anxiety disorder, which used to be called social phobia, which you can think of as, shyness on steroids, right? Very afraid of being evaluated. I knew someone who had this. Once you got to know him, he was very, social and funny and so on, but his hairdresser either passed away or quit, I forget which one, and he grew out his hair for a long time because he could not face going to a new hairdresser. That was too intense of an experience for him. So he looked like Jesus. I worked in a warehouse. So he had like long hair and a beard. So his social anxiety caused him to look like Jesus. So while we're talking with him, I remember I was over at his house one time, and this man, he loved weed a lot. And his clock broke, and so he set it to 4:20. So it was always 4:20 at his house, in multiple senses of the term. Anyways, so where was I going? So that's social anxiety disorder, and then there are various types of specific phobias that you can have. So fear of spiders, fear of snakes, etc. And not all, but many of the specific phobias that we tend to develop probably have something to do with our evolutionary history. So I think I may have mentioned they did a study in Chicago during the crime wave where they looked at what the most common types of fears were, and almost no one had a fear of like guns, knives, or cars, because there were a lot of car accidents too. It was things like snakes and spiders, right? Which there aren't a lot of dangerous snakes and spiders in Chicago, but we are very biologically predisposed to fearing things like that. Another type of anxiety condition is generalized anxiety disorder. So unlike specific phobias, this is chronic underlying anxiety without a specific cause. It's not about one specific thing, it's just constant underlying anxiety. I had a philosophy professor who didn't really like psychology. He once referred to this and he was like, generalized anxiety. Yeah, that's called being alive. That was his interpretation of it. But it is something that can occur, and I'll show a video of someone who would certainly qualify as this. This is the movie What About Bob? He would also qualify as having agoraphobia. He's afraid to leave his house. And claustrophobia, he's afraid of being in small spaces, so he has lots of anxiety-related conditions. And I'm not having fun at his expense. I will note that in this movie, spoiler alert, he winds up becoming a psychiatrist, and his psychiatrist becomes crazy. There's probably some hidden message there or something, but it's a good representation of a couple of the anxiety conditions. Okay, so that's a good representation of, as I say, a few of them. Okay, another anxiety condition, panic disorder, which means you have a proclivity towards panic attacks. So unlike generalized anxiety, where it's constant chronic anxiety, people with panic disorder have sudden, intense attacks of anxiety. Often it feels like a heart attack, right? Incredibly intense. Often without any particular cause. You could be shopping at the mall, and all of a sudden, boop, panic attack. One of my professors used to have this. Told us some stories about it. As the book notes, panic disorder can often lead to agoraphobia. It's one way of developing it, right? If you know that these panic attacks can strike at any time, it may lead to you being afraid of leaving your house for obvious reasons. Next, one that I'm sure many of you have heard of, obsessive compulsive disorder. Sometimes this term is, so the short acronym for it is OCD. Sometimes this term is used in kind of a joking way for someone who's just like really neat and organized. This is more extreme than that. And a good way of leading into what the term means is to break it down into the two words, obsessions and compulsions. The DSM-5 is clear that you need both. Obsessions are persistent, unwanted thoughts. There are different sorts of obsessions you can have, but one that's easy to explain is you can have an obsession with cleanliness or the thought of being contaminated. So what this means is you'll start thinking about the possibility of getting sick or of getting infected or of something being unclean, and you can't get the thought out of your head. So that's the obsession is unwanted thoughts. It's the unwanted thoughts part. The compulsions are the rigid, ritualistic behaviors that you engage in to get rid of the obsessions. So a simple example, you wash your hands constantly throughout the day, or have other sorts of cleaning rituals. Actually, same job, I wasn't going to tell this story, but same job, the warehouse job. So there was Jesus, and the other, or Aaron, I shouldn't say his name, sorry. Hopefully he doesn't watch this. The other guy, who I won't name, we don't know for sure if he had OCD, but we were very concerned. If he did, he definitely chose the wrong job, because I think he claims to have developed it during the job. We were the maintenance crew in the warehouse, so 80% of our job was loading garbage into balers to be crushed. And he had various rituals, so he would spend, I think he said 1 to 2 hours after every shift with various washing things he would do and cleaning, and he had a certain ritual for getting into the house. And if there was ever blood anywhere, like the one time there was like a bloody paper towel or something, he's like, I have to go home. This is too traumatizing. So we were a little bit concerned. But the compulsions have to be some kind of behavior that takes up, the DSM-5 says, at least an hour of your day, typically more than that. So it could be washing your hands over and over again to the point where they might bleed or you lose skin on it, right? So it's not just being a little bit neat and tidy. It's to the point where it interferes with your ability to function properly. So my friend may have not quite been there, but he was definitely dancing on the line. And here's one way to maybe get some empathy for what this might feel like. I'm sure many of you have had the following experience or something like it. You turn the stove off and you go sit down to do whatever, and you think, wait, did I turn the stove off? You go back and turn it off again, but just to make sure. And maybe even go back a third time. Imagine that, but like you do it 100 times. You can't get the thought out of your head that maybe the stove is still on. And then, hours a day on thoughts like that, that's roughly what OCD would feel like. And again, lots of videos in these 2 chapters of people with disorders or people treating them. So I'll show a video of John Green. How many of you know John Green? So he's the author of famous book, Fault in Our Stars. Hank Green, who does Crash Course Psychology, is his brother. So they run various they do Crash Course and Vlogbrothers and various other things. So John Green has OCD, and he has a way with words, so we'll watch him describe what OCD is like. DFTBA means don't forget to be awesome, for those of you who aren't in the Vlogbrothers lingo, don't know the lingo. Okay, so the next section is on different possible causes for anxiety conditions. So, as will be the case for all of the ones we talk about, there is a genetic component. So, identical twins are more likely to be similar for anxiety conditions. And the book doesn't mention this, but my professor in abnormal psych mentioned that there are some studies that find that what's heritable is not the specific anxiety conditions, but a proclivity towards anxiety conditions in general. So if 1 or 2 of your parents have obsessive compulsive disorder or phobia or whatever, what you are more likely to get is one of them. So they seem to have kind of a common heritability, or the way to say it is what's heritable is a risk for developing some kind of anxiety condition. Some researchers have argued or conjectured that it could have to do with the GABA system So GABA is something that slows the brain down. It's released during sleep. It's also released when you drink alcohol. And it is also released by anti-anxiety drugs like Valium, things like that. Now, as I'm going to say this again in the depression section, but often the way researchers argue is a little bit questionable here. I'll just say questionable. It is true that drugs which reduce GABA transmission improve anxiety symptoms. That's true. Increase GABA transmission. So GABA slows you down, so when you increase GABA transmission, you feel more relaxed and calm. But that does not mean necessarily that the initial condition was having low GABA. This is kind of a silly example, but if I give you heroin, you will be calmed down. That does not mean that the cause of the disorder is low heroin. Right? It just means that when you change the brain, you change how people react. Now, I'm not an expert when it comes to GABA. It may be that having low GABA is associated with anxiety. In the case of depression, I will say later that the widely held view, or at least until recently, view that low serotonin causes depression is actually very good evidence that's not true. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. I'll just say there are some people who argue that anxiety conditions have to do with low GABA, GABA being the neurotransmitter that inhibits or slows things down. The book also discusses the fact that there is a sex difference in anxiety conditions. It kind of washes out in the end. Different disorders have different profiles when it comes to gender. So anxiety and depressive disorders are more common in women. Conditions like autism, ADHD, and psychopathy are more common in men. So kind of is a wash. But in the specific case of anxiety, the book mentions that there was a study that controlled for 11 different psychosocial variables. So having trauma in childhood, self-esteem, social support, and various other things, and found that even when you controlled for these things, a difference persisted. There was still a difference in likelihood of developing an anxiety condition. One speculation I've heard, and this is conjectural, but there's one piece of evidence that's consistent with this. Some people have said that given that in our evolutionary past, women had to spend more time caring for children, their nervous systems are designed to be worried on behalf of more than one person. Babies are small, they're very vulnerable, and you kind of have to be worried about everything in the environment. And one thing we'll see later is, in the specific case of OCD, it often emerges after childbirth. When women have to take care of the kid, they're kind of hyper-vigilant about keeping the kid safe, which is good, of course. But this can spiral into a over-obsession with keeping things clean and safe, into the point where it's counterproductive. So that's a bit of a speculative explanation, but that's one that's been put forward. The book then discusses psychodynamic or psychoanalytic possible causes. Freud's term for underlying anxiety is neurotic anxiety, which he believes emerges from unconscious conflict, in particular between the ego and the id, and also just between different repressed pieces of information or repressed thoughts. And he thought that what happens is there's this underlying neurotic anxiety, and it looks for expression, some concrete symbol or thing to latch itself onto. Now, by itself, that's not so crazy. Remember what I said about the heritability of anxiety conditions. What's heritable is a predisposition towards developing some kind of anxiety condition. And then presumably some kind of environmental trigger will decide which of them you are more likely to develop. But Freud, of course, can't stay reasonable. He has to take a plausible idea and then make it crazy. So one example the book gives is there was a little boy named Hans who became afraid that horses would bite him. And Freud says, this is because you have neurotic anxiety due to your castration anxiety. You're afraid your father will cut your penis off, but you don't want to admit that, so you say that you're afraid that the horse will bite you instead. So it's a symbol that you can put the neurotic anxiety onto. So that's pretty crazy. That's what the book says. Gives us an example of how Freud thought about this. For cognitive factors, so cognitive means having to do with beliefs or interpretations, kind of how you process incoming information. Cognitive people emphasize things like catastrophizing, different kinds of thought patterns where your mind goes straight to the worst possible outcome. And of course, cognitive therapy, which we'll see in chapter 17, is going to target those thought spirals, the way that you think about and interpret the world. So as a concrete example, suppose you have a job and your boss criticizes you. Now, that's not fun. No one likes being criticized by their boss. But if you have a certain kind of cognitive style, what your brain will do is go, okay, my boss criticized me. That means I'm going to get fired. That means I'm going to lose all my money. That means I'm going to be homeless and get murdered in the streets. So you go right to the worst possible interpretation, and or as the book says, you catastrophize. So cognitive therapy is going to challenge that kind of thinking. I was going to tell this story before the test, but I thought it wasn't a good time. I wouldn't say I almost got murdered, but I almost got attacked on the train recently. I just want a little quick story. This happened just last week. So I was with someone on the train, and these people came on the bus who I presume were homeless. I don't know for sure, but they were a little irritable, and they were, they looked like they might be homeless, and they were eating Domino's pizza. Good. And it's relevant to the story. You'll see. So I was talking to the person I was with, and I was saying that I like Domino's pizza. I actually had leftover Domino's pizza at home that I was going to have for dinner. But I said my brother thinks that Domino's pizza is warm cardboard, and so we never have it. And they thought, they only heard the second part, so they thought I was mouthing off at them. One of them threw a piece of pizza at me. It's a true story. It hit like my pants, didn't hit me in the face or anything. And then they came up and were like cussing me out, like saying they were gonna fight me or whatever. All I did was put my hand on one of their chests and say, hey, like, you have to back up. I'm glad it didn't escalate beyond that. I do know Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but against two people, there's almost no way to win a fight. Especially Jiu-Jitsu, because Jiu-Jitsu involves taking people to the ground, and that's the last place you want to be if there's two people, because the other person can just kick you in the head. So, anyways, when I talk about getting murdered in the street, my brain went back to that story. So there's a little comedic. And I told all my friends about it, and they made a really smart observation. This whole thing was to defend the honor of Domino's Pizza, but you threw one of the pieces on the ground, so it seems kind of counterproductive. Okay. Another way of explaining anxiety conditions is in terms of past conditioning. So this is how the behaviorists or behaviorally oriented people would explain anxiety conditions. So there's two different ways that it could be relevant. So there's two different kinds of conditioning. This is review from Psych 104. Classical conditioning, which is about forming associations. So think of Pavlov's dog, right? So you ring a bell, give the dog food, ring a bell, give the dog food, and eventually the bell alone will make the dog salivate because he's come to associate the bell with food is coming. And then there's operant conditioning, which is about reward and punishment. Both of these could be relevant. So in the case of classical conditioning, if you have a number of unpleasant experiences with a certain thing, say in your childhood, you will come to associate them. So one person we'll see has a fear of feathers. Presumably she had some kind of set of harmful or traumatic experiences involving birds and now associates feathers with that. So we'll see that in chapter 17. Now, in order for a conditioned association to go away, like in the case of classical conditioning, you have to repeatedly expose yourself to the thing without the thing it was associated with. So in the case of the bell and the food, if you ring the bell over and over and over again without the food, eventually the association will go away. But if the dog avoids the bell or just doesn't hear the bell again, the association will not go away with time. It only goes away with exposure. So what can happen is you have this conditioned association, and then you avoid the thing that you're afraid of now, but then you never experience an extinction of the association. The association stays there. It doesn't go away with time. The way that operant conditioning can be relevant is when you avoid the anxiety-producing thing, so you see the feather and you're afraid, you go away, the anxiety goes away, and then that can feel pleasant. And that can be a way of rewarding yourself for avoiding the thing in question, which then solidifies it as a pattern of behavior, and then the anxiety stays in place. I went over some of that kind of quickly because this is somewhat, or to some degree, review. But any questions about those causes of anxiety conditions? Or the other causes? Okay, last thing for anxiety, and actually this will probably be the last thing for the day. There are also sociocultural variables. So there are different instances of what the book calls culture-bound disorders. One of them is very strange, never a dull moment in psychology. There's a condition called Koro, I might be mispronouncing that, which only emerges in South Asian cultures, which is the fear that one's penis will retract into your abdomen and kill you. And this is, I don't know how that emerged as a cultural pattern, but apparently it's a condition that only exists there. There's another condition the book lists which occurs in Japan. I'm not going to try to pronounce it, but it is excessive fear of offending other people's sensibilities through various means. So Japan is in some ways a very strict society in terms of when you can display emotions or things like that. So that could lead to its emergence in Japan. The other culture-bound disorder the book talks about is anorexia, but that's a separate section, so we'll start next class with anorexia. So see you all in the course.